Did the writer of the most famous version of Cinderella also pen an accidental T for T love story way back in the 17th century? The story of the Marquise-Marquis de Banneville is a French short story written in 1696 with revisions in 1723 about a pair of young nobles who've lived their entire lives as the opposite gender and are lucky to find and fall for each other. Authorship of the tale has been impossible to fully pin down. Scholars have gathered some evidence to pitch probable authorship, and they've mostly settled on a trio of 17th century writers who likely collaborated on the story. Francois Timoleon de Choisy, an abbot famous for his drag persona, Marie-Jeanne Lethier, sorry for that, a well-known French fairy tale writer of the period, and her uncle, Charles Perrault, who wrote some of the most famous versions of fairy tales you likely grew up with, including Cinderella of the Glass Slippers and Pumpkin Coach. The Marquise-Marquis de Banneville is an interesting example of how writers explored gender in 17th century France. Some moments read very ahead of its time in terminology, but of course, other times it is a piece of its era. Let's look at the plot and discuss more. Caveat here, of course, is that I am a cis woman, and my analysis is limited by my experience and knowledge. If you would like to hear this story read and analyzed by a trans creator, CKED has done a long video on the story over on YouTube. There once was a wealthy young couple, a Marquis and Marquise, who were wildly in love with each other, but they only enjoyed a marriage of 6 months before the Marquis was killed in battle. His widow was utterly devastated. Shortly after the death of her husband, the Marquise realized she was with child. While she was excited at the idea of her child connecting her to her lost husband, she was terrified of having a boy and losing him to war in the same way she had lost her love. When she did indeed give birth to a son, she bribed the nurse to announce the birth of her child to be a girl and decided to raise the child as such. Her daughter was christened Maryanne, and the old nurse continued on as the family's governess to protect the family's secret. By the time Maryanne had reached adolescence, as far as she was concerned, she was the girl she was raised to be. She was pretty of face, fashionable, well versed in many talents and fields of study, and utterly charming, and had no idea of the circumstances of her birth. So, right away, this narrative clearly isn't in tune with many modern trans narratives we read. It implies socialization can influence one's gender identity, an idea that I'm sure some conservatives would just love to latch onto and run away with, so warning bells there. But the narrative also portrays a person born in a masculine body who experiences gender euphoria as a girl. She never questions herself. In fact, she initially has some limited ideas about gender expression until she meets people who push those boundaries, and we'll see that later. Back to the story. Now, Maryanne's mother became a little distressed as the child approached her teens, especially because the young gentlemen of the neighborhood all took a liking to Maryanne. But Maryanne was more interested in the attention than the boys themselves. She assured her mother, if it seems like I'm being over affectionate, it's just because of my people pleasing nature. She continued, I have no interest in actually being with any of these provincial boys. She wants much more than this provincial life. Nonetheless, as Maryanne grew older, her mother repeatedly reminded her to consult her before she moved forward with any romantic overtures, and Maryanne agreed to do so. In the meantime, Maryanne was sent off to socialize among her mother's associates. A countess who was a family friend presented Maryanne to local royalty, including a prince who attended his own ball in fabulous drag. The drag queen prince danced with Maryanne, and the room buzzed at the beauty of the pair. Maryanne was fascinated with the prince, but didn't understand his desire to cross-dress. She told this to her mother, who simply advised her daughter to avoid casting judgment. Now, Maryanne's favorite pastime was going to the theater. She loved the drama, she loved how people admired her as she sat in her box watching the show. And one night she noticed another beautiful person in the audience. A young man who styled himself rather androgynously, in the stunning suit men of his era wore, but also wearing earrings and beauty marks that women more commonly wore. The young man caught Maryanne's eye, and it was clear the two were smitten with each other. The man was named the Marquis de Bercourt, who I'll call Bercourt for short. He promptly began courting Maryanne. Maryanne asked him about his penchant for feminine jewelry and makeup, and he said that he'd had his ears pierced since he was a child, and it just felt quite natural to enjoy these types of accessories. And didn't he look great in them? Maryanne concurred. Bercourt began to officially court Maryanne. Maryanne's mother tried to dissuade the girl from falling in love with him, but it was too late for that. The young couple debated whether or not they should marry. Maryanne argued that her many suitors would finally leave her alone, but Bercourt argued that they didn't need to marry to make it plain that they only had eyes for each other. When Maryanne's mother found out that they were seriously considering a union, she panicked. She forbade Maryanne from seeing Bercourt, claiming he was too low a station, and this sent Maryanne into a deep depression, so bad her mother couldn't bear to keep the young lovers apart. Seeing as she couldn't dissuade her daughter from her desire to wed Bercourt, she finally told Maryanne the truth of her birth, that while she had been raised as a young woman, she was born a boy. And that was the reason that she could never marry Bercourt. The truth devastated Maryanne, and she decided to keep living the femme life that she knew and loved and felt was true to herself. To keep Bercourt from proposing, Maryanne's mother told him that her daughter was unable to have children. Bercourt, for his part, was not put off at all. I do not require children, he said. In fact, I don't even require marriage. Maryanne owns my heart, and I hope she will accept that by my word. So Maryanne decided to accept their relationship as it was, and they continued courting each other happily, though always with Maryanne's mother chaperoning. Unfortunately, family tragedy brought the young lovers' relationship under scrutiny. Maryanne's mother died and made her brother Maryanne's guardian. She let the man in on Maryanne's secret. The uncle was not interested in outing Maryanne. He desperately wanted Maryanne's inheritance for his own children, and from what he could see, his so-called niece was a nephew dating a dude, so as long as Maryanne couldn't have children, his own would eventually receive her riches. In the meantime, Maryanne and Bercourt kept courting each other, this time without her mother chaperoning, and that made people talk. Maryanne vehemently told Bercourt that she needed to be his wife to save her reputation, and Bercourt came back to her with a proposition that they marry, but that their relationship continue to remain a chaste one. The two lovers celebrated a lavish wedding. Maryanne had never been happier nor looked more beautiful. But Bercourt was cold to her during the wedding feast. When the couple settled into their nuptial bed, he fully recoiled from her, sitting as far across the bed as he possibly could. Maryanne burst into tears. "Why have you been so unkind to me tonight?" she asked. And at her tears, Bercourt's apathy began to crumble. His lips shook, and tears fell from his eyes. "My dear, you haven't done a thing. Rather, you have been nothing but devoted, while I have been deceiving you all along." Bercourt took Maryanne's hand, and he held it to his chest, and it was much shapelier than she expected. "I'm afraid that you find yourself married to a woman, and not the man I have presented myself to be," he told her. And Maryanne's eyes lit up. "It's funny you should mention that." She embraced Bercourt, and now in her nightie, very close and intimate, it became clear that she was shapelier in some areas than was to be expected. And the two had a good laugh, sort of like that couple in the Pina Colada song who realized they're both cheating on each other but with each other, except this is a lot more wholesome and less in need of marriage counseling. They discussed how they should move forward, and they realized that they didn't need to change a thing. Maryanne was a woman and Bercourt was a man. They were in love with each other, and sharing their backgrounds and the secrets they kept only brought them closer. As for Maryanne's greedy uncle, he was very surprised when he visited the couple a year later to find that they had bore a child after all. And as far as we know, he never truly put two and two together, and so Maryanne and the Marquis de Banneville lived happily ever after. This seemingly heterosexual union at the end of the tale naturally lets its authors get away with a relationship that would have been too scandalous for its era if the couple's downstairs parts matched. But of course, from a modern perspective, relationships between trans partners are generally regarded as queer, regardless of the gender combo and their sexual orientation. Plus, the story mimics the reasons that some trans people find comfort exclusively dating other trans people. They understand each other and their struggles more than a cis partner might. It's equal parts love and attraction and protection in a world that can be really weird about transness. I really love this little story, if anything, because it's a clear indicator of how long we've been exploring non binary and trans forms of gender identity. You can add it to your library to throw at someone who accuses transness of being a modern fad. To my trans and non-binary audience, well, first off, call me in or call me out if I totally fucked up anything in this video. I hope that me connecting with you over the years has given me a good sense of what this story could mean, but of course, I always want to learn. But above all, I am so happy to have you in my community. And to my cis audience, I encourage you to take care of your trans neighbors now more than ever during truly the worst comeback in history. And if anyone out there disagrees, kindly make like a pipe cleaner and get bent. Thank you for watching.